I want to share 3 more principles for strength and power in writing with you. First, this formula: power in writing equals content divided by space. What this means is that our goal is not to fill up a certain amount of pages, but to actually find a way to get the maximum amount of content into the fewest words in the smallest space possible. If I can say the same thing in 10 pages or in 5 pages, the 5-page version is going to be more powerful. If after I write a rough draft, I can find a way to cut out every unnecessary word, if I can find simpler phrasing instead of a long, complex, convoluted sentence, some short, punchy way to make the same point, that kind of compression, or in writing terms, what we sometimes call concision, to be concise and brief and focused, that's going to create power in our writing. When you are writing for me, and I hope for the rest of your academic and professional career, when you write for anybody, please never fluff your work. Don't ever feel like you're having to just fill up space. It's always better to write shorter than expected, but pour in more detailed and rich content. And that one skill is really at the heart of a lot of things we're trying to practice this semester. Second, good writing is always question and problem driven. You don't want to just fill up space with a rambling list of facts, but you want some clear question to be driving and motivating what you write. What is it you're curious about? What problem needs to be solved? There has to be a question at the back of any research-based argument so that you can know when you've answered the question and when you're done writing. And in that light, your goal is always to have a clear point that you're making, some kind of affirmation. We call this the thesis. It is given meaning by the question that's in the background that's being answered. And in light of that question, your whole writing should aim to make one point. Now, you should be able to boil your point down to a single sentence. There's also a 1-paragraph version of the point and a 2-page version of explaining the point with some more detail, and also a 7.5-page standard term paper length version of making the argument that proves this point. For professionals, for academics that go on to do more scholarly work, there's also the scholarly journal article length, 15 to 30-page length version of making the point, and a full book that fleshes out and details that one thesis. But it all begins with you in a class like this being able to have one point and make everything in your essay work to support that point. If it's not part of proving the point, you cut it out. But you include everything that is relevant and necessary to make that point convincingly. All right, third principle. Good, strong writing is paragraph-driven, which means that in the flow of the paper, as you're making your point, the paragraphs should be bricks of thought. Each paragraph has a first sentence that we often call the topic sentence, which is like a mini thesis, the point of that paragraph in simple terms. And everything else, the rest of the sentences in the paragraph, should flesh out and demonstrate and give concreteness to the idea in the topic sentence. If you follow this principle well, look at one of the things that happens. We could expect that a paper that you write is going to look something like this. If you were to lay out the pages like a storyboard, we know in a term paper, about 7 pages usually, you're going to have a heading, you'll have a title. In a paper this length, there's usually going to be an introduction paragraph, and we can know that your thesis statement has to come before the bottom of page 1. You need to get to the point and say what your point is quickly. And in any paper over 5 pages, it's usually a good idea to use subheadings and sections to show the separate steps of what you're demonstrating. Not a lot of students realize that you can do this, but I think it always strengthens a paper. It strengthens the way it comes across to your teacher or your readers, and it always strengthens it for you too, because you have to think carefully about the steps you're taking to make your point. So let's say the first subheading is right here, a little left justified bolded title, something, a word or a short phrase that gets at the gist of what this first section is about. And then usually we'll have a little introductory paragraph to that first subsection that's just summarizing everything that's going to be in this section. And then probably 2 or 3 paragraphs here to the end of section 1. Then another subheading, a little introductory paragraph for that section, and then a few paragraphs for section 2. A third subheading with its own little introductory paragraph for that section, and several paragraphs for section 3. Now there's kind of a logical tendency that the sections get more complicated and therefore maybe a little longer as the paper goes on, because usually we start explaining the easy things first and then we move to the more complicated. So I'm going to add an extra paragraph in this section. Maybe we would need a little more room to work out the thoughts. And then a heading that says conclusion right here, and let's say 2 concluding paragraphs. When we lay out a paper this way, and we have our works cited page, our bibliography of all the sources we used in the paper here on the end. When we lay out a paper this way, we can know, even before we start, a couple of things that help us predict the structure. We know the introduction has some very simple, specific jobs to do. We have to hook the reader's interest in the topic. We have to say who cares about it and why the problem or the question that's driving the paper matters. And we have to kind of give a roadmap of how the rest of it's going to proceed, as well as stating our thesis, the point we're going to reach in the end. All of that can be done in 4 or 5 sentences at the front end, but it takes some work. And actually, we shouldn't waste time trying to write the introduction until the very end of the writing process. Maybe write a sketch of it, just a guess. But when you're drafting, it's usually easier to actually write the middle sections in whatever order comes easiest to you and get the details worked out. Then it's a lot easier to come back at the beginning and write an introduction that tells what you've already put down on paper. We know that each of these sections is going to go into detail, laying out the 3 major steps in making the case for our main point. And we know the conclusion at the end has a couple of very specific jobs. Most of us know that a conclusion should restate and sum up what's already gone before, but I would recommend don't take more than 2 sentences re-saying things that you've already said. Very briefly summarize it. The rest of the conclusion has a different job, which is to point forward. And think about questions like these. What are the limits of what you've said so far? What do you know you have not yet examined that someone else would do well to dig deeper in? That's a really useful thing to state at the end of your paper. How is your discussion part of a bigger conversation? That conclusion may be a good place to bring in some of the larger background issues or voices that you've learned about. Even if you haven't spent any time digging into them in the body of your essay, it just gives your essay a broader context that makes the intellectual work you're doing more valuable. So, again, explaining what the problem is, giving your thesis, and giving a roadmap for how you'll proceed. In every section, giving an introduction to that section, and then developing that section's material in depth. In the conclusion, briefly summing up, and then pointing forward beyond the paper for other questions that need to be examined and the bigger concerns that make it all significant. The problem in writing a 7 to 8 page paper is actually how to make it short enough when you do those tasks well. The problem is not filling up that much space. And if you use this kind of paragraphing system well, look at this trick. This is really cool. You can test how tight and clear your argument is if you read this sentence, your thesis statement, and then jump from topic sentence to topic sentence through the body of the paper. You could even cut and paste those sentences into a new document to make a paragraph of their own to check, do those topic sentences sound like their own train of thought? If they don't sound like a clear train of thought, if they sound jarring and off on tangents, play with the wording in that kind of abstracted out paragraph, make it all flow into one train of thought, and then plug those topic sentences back into the paragraphs throughout the essay, and instantly you will have tightened up and clarified the flow of your argument. So when this is working well, your essay is operating at 2 levels, kind of the abstract and the concrete. At the big view, it's making these big jumps over the main points, the larger picture, but then paragraph by paragraph, it keeps diving down into the details to give all of the concrete information that your reader needs to be convinced that you know what you're talking about. Or to think about it with another metaphor, your paper should feel like someone swimming laps. Have you ever watched an Olympic swimmer? The swimmer dives under the water and then strains hard and then comes up for air before diving in again. At the topic sentences, those sentences should be simple and clear, and they should make your reader feel like a swimmer coming up for air. Very clear, easy to understand the main point, and then in the body of the paragraph, you dive into more depth and complexity. It's even true at a syntax level that if we go through a really well-polished paper, the topic sentences should mostly be short and simple sentences, and then the sentences in the middle of the paragraph should be a mix of simple and more complex or compound complex sentence structures. So all of that to say, if you use strong paragraphing, you will have a well-developed and clear argument, whether it's 1 page or 7 pages, or those of you going on to grad school or a professional career, much longer pieces of writing.